What's up, Josh? How are you? Good. Anybody not ready? Okay. All right, good afternoon. On May 25th, 2017, there was a use of force incident by Deputy Alexander Edge and Deputy Jason Fineran involving Jimarez Reed. Approximately 2 months ago, we received a complaint that the force used was excessive. A copy of a video partially showing the incident was released to the media by Reed's attorney, and we began an internal investigation. We interviewed about 12 witnesses, including Reed and the deputies. Some people present at the scene that night refused to be interviewed. The interviews of the deputies and sworn statements involve over 15 hours of recorded statements. I personally listened to all of the deputy interviews in addition to reviewing the partial video of the incident numerous times and other evidence that is part of this internal affairs case. This is a very serious incident with serious allegations, and I've wrestled with the decision on the outcome because it's paramount that we get it right and that we are fair to all involved. The amount of scrutiny, the amount of review, and the diligence to uncover the truth and determine exactly what happened and why is unprecedented in any recent Pinellas County Sheriff's Office internal investigations. But it is because of that effort that I know my decision on the outcome is correct, it's fair, and consistent with the law and policy. To the extent that anyone has concerns or wants to disagree with the decisions I have made in this case, it's only right and fair that they listen to the 15 hours of testimony and review all of the evidence that I reviewed in reaching my decision before offering their opinion. Opinion should not be offered in a vacuum and must not be based solely on a partial and incomplete video that does not tell the whole story. Use of force never looks good, and sometimes what looks good is awful, but it's sometimes justified and lawful. What I'm going to do now, and I'm going to run through this so we have the context, is I'm going to play the relevant portion of this video, the video itself that begins with Deputy Fineran's dash camera and runs through the entire incident. But we're going to play just the relevant portion, and then I'll run through what the investigation revealed. So go ahead and play the video.
Captain, we're 2325. One car.
side. So I stopped it at the point where they're able to get Reed handcuffed. We'll make the entire video available to all of you that want it. Again, this is a video that is a partial depiction of what happened. Everything that happened prior to Deputy Fineran arriving on scene with his co-ban in-car video was not recorded. I'm going to run through for you the chronology of what happened. On, again, May 25th at about 11:15 p.m., Deputy Edge responded to 7171 79th Street North in Pinellas Park. That's the residence of the video you just saw. And he was called there because there was a person who was refusing to leave. There was some type of a altercation going on, and the person was refusing to leave. That person was Jimarez Reed. As Deputy Edge was en route to the call, he was told that Reed may have a weapon. As it was later determined, Reed showed up at this residence, which is his former girlfriend, Melissa Sanford's home, with a gun to confront a person known only as RJ, who was Sanford's new boyfriend. Patrick Wilson, who's the person that you see in the video, the citizen, was visiting Sanford's home and encountered Reed in the driveway of the residence. And Reed had a .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun in his hand, and he was concealing the gun behind his back. While waiting for deputies to arrive, Reed walked toward his car that was parked in the street, and he had the .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun in his hand. When Deputy Edge arrived, he was told by Wilson and others that Reed had the gun and that he had walked to the street. Because Deputy Edge had been told that Reed was armed with a gun, Deputy Edge approached Reed at gunpoint and ordered him to the ground. Reed refused to follow Deputy Edge's commands and began running around the car in circles. So as this chase going on around the car, as Deputy Edge had his gun out and was trying to get Reed to show his hands and to go to the ground. Reed was yelling, he was screaming, and acting in a very erratic manner. Deputy Edge called for backup and had reason to believe, based on the information provided by Sanford and others, during that entire time that Reed was armed with that .45 caliber handgun. Reed was standing behind the car with his hands down by his waist, below the line of the car and below the line of sight of Deputy Edge, so that Deputy Edge could not see Reed's hands. So what you see in the video is Reed on the passenger side of the car. He's running around the car, and when he's at gunpoint, is that he's got his hands down below the visual line of sight of the car, and he's refusing to follow commands when Edge had been told that he had this .45 caliber handgun. Reed refused multiple orders by Edge to show his hands to get on the ground, and none of that is captured on any audio or videotape because none was activated at the time. There was no camera present. Deputy Edge described Reed as acting like a lunatic and that he was out of control. Deputy Edge was in fear that Reed had the gun and thought that he was going to be shot. Deputy Edge refrained from using deadly force on Reed at that time, and he had reason to believe that Reed was armed, non-compliant, hiding his hands, and out of control. Reed's erratic behavior and non-compliance with Deputy Edge's commands is verified by Patrick Wilson, and Wilson confirmed Reed was yelling, screaming, and out of control. Patrick Wilson had never met Reed prior to that night. Upon Deputy Fineran's arrival, he parked so that his car and in-car camera captured Reed and Edge, and that's what you see in the video as Deputy Fineran arrives on scene. At that point, Reed was still behind his car, but as you see in the video, had placed his hands on the hood of the car and complied with Deputy Fineran's direction to get on the ground. As Deputy Fineran was giving Reed directions, Deputy Edge decided to walk to the back of Reed's car and approach him from the rear. At that point, Deputy Edge had probable cause to arrest Reed for obstructing because he was not following commands. He was running around the car. He believed he was armed, and he was non-compliant. By approaching Reed from the rear, Deputy Edge created a crossfire situation, and there were no verbal communications occurring between Deputy Edge and Deputy Fineran. The best practice in dealing with an armed subject under those circumstances was to use the technique of cover and contact and wait for enough deputies to arrive before safely making contact with Reed. There was no need to rush and make contact with Reed, and doing so was actually dangerous under those circumstances. Deputy Edge's actions were premature, they were unnecessary, contrary to effective police practices, and caused a use of force situation that could and should have been avoided. And Deputy Edge is being held responsible for these improper actions. Nonetheless, when Deputy Edge jumped on Reed's back, he did not see Reed's right hand. He believed Reed had a gun in his waistband, and he was in fear for his life because of Reed's erratic behavior and what he believed was Reed's immediate access to the gun. Because Deputy Edge was in fear of being shot, albeit unnecessarily because he should not have made physical contact with Reed, Deputy Edge delivered 7 forearm strikes to Reed's head as a distraction and pain compliance technique to keep Reed from reaching for the gun, and that's what you saw in the video. These strikes were with the soft part of Deputy Edge's forearm, and all of these strikes, all 7 strikes, were delivered within 6 seconds. Very short amount of time. These were not full-blown strikes, and there was no sustained injury to Reed based upon this striking action with Edge's forearm. When Deputy Edge jumped on Reed's back and Reed again became non-compliant, he began bracing, tensing, and actively resisting. Because of Reed's resistance, Deputy Edge pulled Reed's hair in an effort to keep Reed from reaching for the gun that Deputy Edge believed was in Reed's waistband. Deputy Edge testified during the internal investigation that he was in fear for his life and was waiting to hear the gunshot from Reed. Because of Reed's continued resistance and Deputy Edge not having control of Reed's hands, he used a chokehold to, quote, tie Reed up. Now, when looking at that, anybody watching this video is going to call that a chokehold. But from all the witness testimony and from looking at the video, Deputy Edge had Reed around the upper body. He had him in that area between his chin and his shoulders, but in no way, shape, form, or at any time was Reed's airflow restricted, and he was not choked. It was merely to gain control of Reed under those circumstances. So while it looks like a chokehold, it was not a chokehold because there was no choking occurring. And at no time did Reed stop talking, did he stop yelling, did he stop screaming? And again, there was nothing that compromised his airflow. Deputy Edge rolled over and kept Reed on the ground while other deputies and Sean Wilson attempted to gain control of Reed's arms and handcuff him. All of the deputies and Mr. Wilson testified that Reed was unnaturally strong and they believed that he was under the influence of narcotics because of his erratic actions and this exceptional strength. We asked Reed and his attorney for his hospital medical records from that night to determine his blood alcohol level and the presence of narcotics in Reed's system, and they refused to provide us with those records. Deputy George Martinez arrived on the scene, and that's the deputy you see arriving on the video after Edge was, of course, already there. Fineran was there. The next deputy on scene was Deputy Martinez. He used his taser with a drive stun, which is removing the cartridge and attempting to gain pain compliance through the use of the drive stun on the taser, and that was ineffective to get Reed to stop resisting and to comply. Deputy Fineran was attempting to gain control of Reed's left arm, and Reed grabbed Deputy Fineran's fingers. And at that point, because Reed was grabbing Deputy Fineran's fingers and had a grasp on them, That's when he used his handcuffs to strike Reed's arm to get Reed to release his grasp on Deputy Fineran's hand. Deputy Fineran was able to gain control of Reed's left arm, but as the struggle continued, he became exhausted. He was losing control of Reed's arm, and Reed's arm was at his waist, and that is where Deputy Fineran believed that Reed had the .45 caliber handgun. Because he was in fear that Reed would be able to access the gun with his slipping away hand, that's when Deputy Fineran struck Reed in the side of his face, and you see those 5 strikes that were distraction and pain compliance strikes so that he could gain control again of Reed's hand. When you look at those strikes, it seems obvious to me and to those of us that have watched this many times that those were what somebody would characterize as rabbit strikes. As you can see what Fineran was doing, it was like this. It wasn't some full-blown strike. He was just trying to use enough force to get Reed to comply so that he didn't lose a grip on Reed's arm and Reed couldn't get to the gun that he thought was in his waistband. The deputies were eventually able to gain control of Reed's arms and handcuff him. During a recorded phone call from the Pinellas County Jail on June 14th, Reed was discussing this incident with Sanford. That's his former girlfriend who lived at that residence where he arrived to confront her current boyfriend with a gun. And as he was discussing, Reed was discussing with Sanford this incident, he said, and I quote, "I think I was drinking that night. I like to bleed. I like to fight. I like all that expletive. That expletive turns me on. Blood makes my slang hard. A battle is what I live for." Deputy Fineran and Deputy Edge, during the internal investigation, had charges of policy violations involving the use of force. The Administrative Review Board unsubstantiated the excessive force allegation against Deputy Fineran, as the strikes were justified because Fineran was losing control of Reed's arm at the time he administered the strikes and believed that Reed had the gun in his waistband, and prior to that, Reed had been grabbing at his hand, and that's why he struck him with the handcuffs. The Administrative Review Board found that Deputy Edge had violated Pinellas County Sheriff's Office policy because he unnecessarily made physical contact with Reed that caused the use of force. As I said before, this situation could and should have been avoided had Deputy Edge not jumped on Reed's back and he had waited for backup deputies so that contact could have been made with Reed safely. It's never a good idea or acceptable practice by a deputy sheriff to create a crossfire situation, holster your gun, jump on the back of someone he believes to be armed with a gun, do it by himself, and try to contain or disarm that person, especially when that person is out of control, acting irrational, and had already refused to comply at gunpoint. Deputy Edge will receive a 15-day suspension, which is significant, and be required to attend retraining on the use of force decision-making. While Deputy Edge should not have jumped on Reed's back, once he did so, while Reed's arm was free and Deputy Edge had reason to believe that he had the gun in his waistband, against the backdrop of Reed's previous resistance and failing to comply with commands, Deputy Edge was within lawful limits in delivering the strikes to Reed. Further, once Reed fought back, while believed to be armed, it was within lawful limits for Deputy Edge to pull Reed's hair and place him in the upper body hold. Now, a gun was not found on Reed's person because he had placed it in his car just prior to Deputy Edge's arrival. But 2 guns were found in Reed's car. One, the .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun that Patrick Wilson saw and told Deputy Edge that Reed had in his possession, and a second .380 caliber semi-automatic handgun was also found in Reed's car. As we look at this situation, we have to view it against the backdrop of what we know to be lawful and proper regarding the use of force. And all use of force by law enforcement officers has to be reasonable and it has to be necessary. The United States Supreme Court in 1989 in a case called Graham versus Connor established the constitutional framework under which all law enforcement use of force must be measured and judged. The Supreme Court established that the use of force has to be objectively reasonable given the specific facts and circumstances, and that officers are judged under a standard of what a similarly situated officer would do in like circumstances. One of the very important tenets that has carried its way through all use of force policies and use of force law since that Supreme Court decision in 1989 is what the Supreme Court cautioned. And the U.S. Supreme Court cautioned that officers necessarily make split-second decisions that must not be judged through 20/20 hindsight or, in effect, Monday morning quarterbacked. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that there are not limits on officers' use of force. There most certainly are. But judging Deputy Edge and Deputy Fineran's actions through a partial video of this entire situation, taken from a different angle than their views, with different lighting, and not considering what they reasonably believed at the time they used force is the epitome of doing what the Supreme Court held should not be done, and that is to judge an officer with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. To put it simply, just because you can doesn't mean you should, and if it's not in the best practice, then you should not do it. And Deputy Edge should not have gone hands-on with Reed, but once he did, his actions were reasonable and lawful. As I said earlier, the use of force never looks good, and sometimes what looks awful is in fact justified and lawful. In addition to the improper decision to engage Reed, the Administrative Review Board also found that Deputy Edge violated policy by not conducting a thorough investigation and failed to properly handle evidence. Specifically, deputies found a pair of brass knuckles in Reed's pocket, and Deputy Edge failed to place them in evidence, and their whereabouts are currently unknown. When Deputy Fineran arrived on the scene, he intentionally turned off the microphone that's attached to his gun belt for that in-car video, and that's why you don't hear the audio. You do hear it come on again and then get turned off again, but the reason why there's no audio initially is because Deputy Fineran intentionally turned it off, which is a direct violation of Pinellas County Sheriff's Office policy. Deputy Fineran testified, for whatever the reason, that he has a habit of turning off his microphone and acknowledged that that was an intentional action on his part. Deputy Fineran will receive a 5-day suspension for turning off that microphone, which would have provided valuable evidence in this case, because we would have been able to hear what everybody else says was occurring during the incident. So happy to take any questions that you have.
So when did these suspensions begin? When have they already been suspended?
Well, I met with the deputies today. They were told of my decision, told of the suspensions, and how it works here is they'll meet with their bureau commander and the dates of the suspensions will be assigned.
Edge 15 days.
Fineran's 5 days.
And to be clear on what they were suspended for,
Right.
Edge, well, Fineran was the turning off the mic.
Right.
And then Edge, what was his specific violation?
What's a policy violation regarding the use of force, and that he should not have engaged Reed under those circumstances the way he did. There was absolutely no need for him to go hands-on at that time, no need for him to approach him, no need for him to put himself in that situation where the force that was used needed to be used. This whole situation could and should have been avoided. Edge could and should have avoided it. His premature actions were inconsistent with practices, with policy, and the way that he should have conducted himself. He, in essence, caused the situation by making the decisions that he did, but once he engaged, because of Reed's actions and because of the history of what happened that night, and because of the presence of what he believed and had absolute reason to believe was the .45 caliber handgun in Reed's waistband, and Reed's hand being free, then it's not improper legally and as far as the amount of force under those circumstances, but he shouldn't have let it happen to begin with.
How long
And
have they both been on the force?
Fineran's been here about 3 years. He previously worked for the Polk County Sheriff's Office, I believe for about 4 years. He has 7 years law enforcement experience, and Edge has been here for about 4 years. Fineran has no prior discipline here. Edge has one prior discipline incident where he missed a court appearance on a subpoena earlier this year, but other than that, both of them have good performance records.
Will they both get more training because you said they approached the vehicle? If Reed had a gun, he could have easily shot them. He did have cover.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, and most especially Edge needs training and retraining in use of force decision making and when it's appropriate and when it's not to engage someone. You know, again, when you look at it, you see what he did. He needs some retraining in this area.
Is that training routine for people out in the field?
It is. Everybody receives the training. I mean, he received training in this when he started here and as he goes through in-service training. So he's already been trained in it once, but obviously it wasn't enough. It didn't resonate with him so that he made the right decision here. So we need to retrain him in this.
They never have refresher training?
They do. They go through in-service, absolutely. All the deputies do. Every year they go through training. And sometimes, many times a year, they go through training. So he received initial training, a lot of it. He's received refresher training, but obviously he needs some specialized training and more concentrated in this particular area to help him make better decisions going forward.
Has Reed's attorney indicated that she intends to sue the department over this?
Oh, I'm sure she will. She hasn't said for sure, but I'm sure she will.
Was dismissal ever on the table for either of the deputies?
Yeah, it was. Termination was on the table. I really wrestled with this, as I said. This was one that took a lot of time, a lot of thought, a lot of review. Our system here is a pretty extensive internal affairs system. Because of the volume, because of the way the system works, I rarely personally review all the evidence in the case, spend time listening to all the interviews, and conduct a real hands-on analysis. And I did that in this case because it's so important. And I wanted to make sure that we got it right. And I went back and forth quite a bit with it. And at the end of the day, there is enough evidence, the right amount of evidence, to give credence to what Fineran and Edge said happened, and not enough evidence that supports an opposite view that they weren't telling the truth in this. And when Edge came up behind Reed, the headlights from the cruiser with the video were coming straight at him. He approaches him and says he doesn't see his hand, the right hand. And he knows in his mind that he has this .45 caliber handgun in his waist. And there is a lot of testimony, a lot of evidence that supports that position. And what I needed to make sure was that that was honest, it was truthful, it's credible, and there's evidence that supports it. And as long as there is, then what he did is within the limits of acceptable use of force. If the evidence doesn't support that, then he could be outside the limits, and that's where termination would be appropriate. So was it ever on the table? Yeah, it was on the table, because we go into these things, and I go into these things with a complete open mind, wanting to get the just result, the right result, the correct result, and wherever it takes us, it takes us. Unfortunately, I've been in office now, 7 years. I've terminated way too many people, but if it needs to be done, I'll do it. People know that by now. I have no hesitation in doing it. And when it needs to be done, you're gone and you're out of here. But at the same time, when it doesn't need to be done, and the right thing to do is to do something short of that, then I'm going to do the right thing. And whatever people feel, they feel. But like I said earlier, is that anybody that has any thoughts, concerns, questions, you need to go read the entire file. You need to listen to all of the interviews. You need to look at what I looked at and come into the decision that I came to before you think about criticizing what the decision is, because it's not fair.
Who didn't cooperate?
Well, Melissa Sanford, for one, she was limitedly cooperative. She came in a couple times and then wouldn't come back. Yeah, the girlfriend. There was another person there by the name, who's a friend, who was this woman by the name of Ray Grunza. She wouldn't come in. There were a few people there that just refused to cooperate. We had talked to a couple of citizen witnesses in the neighborhood. We did a complete neighborhood canvass out there and talking to people. Most people cooperated, but a couple people said they just didn't want to get involved in it and just wouldn't be interviewed. So there were probably 4 or 5, maybe total in the investigation, that just wouldn't talk to us at all.
With his hands on the hood in the video, you see that he's pushing out, he's leaning over the car.
He still has that weapon in his waistband?
Absolutely, absolutely, because that's all the information there was. And at that point, when he had his hands, and he was, at that point, he had been non-compliant with Edge. And so what you see there is when Fineran gets there, and the person standing in the road in the video, that's Deputy Edge. You don't see Fineran at first because he's pulling up in the cruiser and is captured on the video. And what you see in the flashlight you see, the light you see on Reed, that's a light that's attached to Edge's gun. So he's got him at gunpoint, and he had not been listening to him, he had not been complying. But once Fineran got there and Edge moved back to the side, Fineran started giving him commands, and he started complying with Fineran. That's when he put his hands up on the top of the car. His hands had not been on top of the car. His hands had been down here below line of sight and below the line of the car, which was giving Edge great concern, because here you got a guy that's got a gun, a .45 caliber semi-automatic, and he's not showing his hands. He's acting crazy. He's acting out of control. He's yelling, screaming, running around the car. And what Edge, rightfully so, was concerned about, that the next thing, as soon as that hand came up, there was a gun in it, and he was going to start shooting. So, but when Fineran got there, that's when he did comply, and that's where you see his hands up on the top, and that's when you see him get on the ground. And then notice, too, in the video, is that, again, he shouldn't have done it. But when Edge came up behind him, is that Reed turns around and is pushing up and is turning around to the side as Edge is coming up behind him. So, in coming up so fast the way he did, Edge also took that as non-compliance and thought Reed was trying to get up off the ground.
So when he puts his hands on top of the car, at that point, they think that he had stuck his gun in his waistband?
In the waistband.
And who was it that said he had a gun again? Who called 911 and sparked this whole thing?
Melissa Sanford's the one that called the police to begin with, his former girlfriend. Wilson was in the driveway, and
he's just a neighbor?
no, Wilson is the boyfriend of a friend of Sanford's, and they had come there to see Sanford. So Patrick Wilson is just a citizen who happened to be there with his girlfriend, who was there to see Sanford, and just happened to be there and knew nothing about Reed, doesn't know Reed, saw Reed the first time that night, has never seen him since, just a citizen minding his own business.
And how did he come to the conclusion that Reed had a gun?
He saw it. He saw it because Reed was acting, he came up and Reed was acting suspicious, and he was in the driveway, and he had the .45 and he had it in his hand, and he had it kind of partially behind his back. So he saw the gun, and he knew that he had a gun, and that of course concerned Wilson.
The suspensions are without pay, correct?
Correct, yeah, absolutely.
Sheriff Reed's attorney said she felt like race played a role in this. In light of the national things that have happened, your investigation, I mean, you found that that wasn't the case, or what can you say about that?
Yeah, well, absolutely not. You know, it just had no play in this at all. You know, what had play in this is that you got a guy who is acting irrationally, who appeared to be under the influence of alcohol and or narcotics, was acting like a lunatic, had a gun, had a .45 caliber, had it in his hand. When approached by a law enforcement officer in uniform to show his hands and get on the ground, he refuses. He yells and screams and runs around and is totally non-compliant. And you got a guy who continues to resist, continue to oppose law enforcement, and then you got a guy who, after the incident's over with, gets on the phone and tells the woman that he likes to fight and likes blood, and it makes his, slang hard and all this other stuff. I mean, that's what this is about. As much as, and make no mistake, Deputy Edge was wrong. Deputy Edge did not use effective police practices, didn't use proper technique, should not have jumped on the guy's back, should not have done this. But Jimarez Reed is very wrong in this too. Jimarez Reed could have prevented this from happening by not showing up drunk, high, whatever he was, non-cooperative with a .45 caliber gun in his hand, and when approached by a deputy, be non-compliant. And if Reed had complied with the command at gunpoint to get on the ground and put your hands out, we wouldn't even be here talking about this. So that doesn't excuse Deputy Edge's misconduct and what he did and the things he did improper. So make no mistake, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that Jimarez Reed's got skin in this. Jimarez Reed had the gun. Jimarez Reed was uncooperative. Jimarez Reed's acting like a lunatic. Jimarez Reed is failing to comply with a law enforcement officer at gunpoint who's telling him to get on the ground and start doing circles around the car, yelling and screaming like a crazy guy. So, that has nothing to do with race. It has to do with a guy who, one, shouldn't have showed up at his girlfriend's house with a gun in his hand and then done what he did.
Can you just briefly describe what Deputy Edge should have done, after the car pulls up?
Yeah.
So now he's there and Fineran's on scene, and basically we start where we see it with the guy's hands are on the hood, and then I guess he's, like you said, he starts to comply a little bit with Fineran. So from that point on, what should Deputy, obviously he shouldn't have jumped on it, but what should he have done? And if Reed is still not complying, then what do you do?
Right, so at that point is that the troops were coming, okay? Is on the radio, they'd call for backup. There were numerous deputies that were on their way and employed what we call a cover contact, where you get enough people there and you establish what's called a tactical L, so you don't have a crossfire situation. So you have, in this case, Reed would have been here, you would have had deputies over here, you would have had deputies over here. They're in a tactically sound position and they get a plan as to how to approach him. And you would have had a situation where you had people with, because he was believed to be armed with this .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun, you would have had people with the appropriate amounts of lethal force and non-lethal force, like taser, etc. And then you would have had a plan, and they would have communicated. They would have been communicating with Reed, told him what to do to get his hands away from his body so that they could safely approach him and handcuff him. And it could have been done in a very methodical, safe way that would have avoided all of this. And there was no rush. There was no reason at that point, when he had just started to comply, there was no reason to rush up to him from the back the way that he did, which then caused Reed to get up off the ground and push up and turn around, which started the non-compliance, and then he couldn't see his hand, and we ended up in this situation.
Sheriff, what do you make of Deputy Fineran turning off and muting that audio intentionally?
Well, like I said, it's wrong. It's contrary to policy. He absolutely shouldn't have done it. It's totally unacceptable, especially in a circumstance when he gets there and he's got the guy at gunpoint. So when he's got him at gunpoint is when he turns it off. It's illogical. It doesn't make any sense. I can't make any sense of it. That's why he's being held responsible for it. He's got a 5-day suspension. I don't think he'll do it again, and he will change his practices in that regard. It's just something that he said that he did as a matter of course, unless he was actively trying to collect evidence such as in an interview or a traffic stop. I don't know where he gets it from, because that's totally contrary to our policy.
Was Reed treated for any injuries after this?
He went to the hospital and then he was released. He had some lacerations on his face, and when he went to the ground is where that came from.
Would there be any reason to go back and check to see if there was other audio from other cases that he turned off, other situations where he
Well, there is, because he admitted it. That's what he did. But there's nothing that we know that's missing, nothing's come up, but he said he was doing it. That was his normal course, so.
So we turned off the microphone to his dash cam video, or not
Yeah.
body cam?
We don't have body cameras. So it was the dash cam video, but with the dash cam video, all the deputies have a microphone pack that's on the gun belt. And so it gets automatically activated. And in this case, it was automatically activated because he turned on his emergency equipment in the car, which activates the camera and the microphone. And then when he got out of the car, after arriving, he actually had to push a button and turn it off.
We only see part of the video because of where the cars were placed?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear
We
you.
only see, you were talking about how it's only partial video.
Right.
We only see part of it because of where the cars were placed?
Well, that's some of it. But what I'm saying is partial is that it only partially captures the entire event. Is that it's partial video. You're not seeing the part ahead of time where he is 4 times in circles running around, acting crazy, yelling, screaming, having a gun pointed at him, non-compliant. You're not seeing any of that. When he's standing behind the car and he's got his hands down like this, that Edge was using restraint and not using deadly force because he was faced with a guy that he had been told had a .45 caliber handgun. The citizen had seen the .45 caliber handgun. The guy was acting erratic. He was running around the car. He wasn't complying, and he's standing there like this. You reaches a point where you got to make a decision, and the decision has got to be something that you make before the gun comes up and you get shot. You can't wait for somebody to start shooting at you. So, Edge was in a tough situation there, and he actually exercised discretion and judgment and not shooting at Reed when Reed was failing to follow his commands and refused to lift his hands up from above the car. And Wilson says that that's what was happening. So, but that's not on video.
Would this change your mind at all, or about body cameras? Because you maybe would see what happened in the beginning.
No, because again, it's the same thing. I'm going to rehash my position on body cameras. Body cameras are not the end-all, be-all. They don't tell everything. The cameras tell you they're one tool. They tell you some things, but they can also take things out of context. And in some respects here, this camera is taking things out of context, because what this camera is doing is the dashboard of the car, and the lights are going this way, the angle's going this way, and when you look at the video, you can see things because of the angle and because of the lights and because of where the car's positioned and where Reed's positioned that Edge couldn't see. So if somebody's just watching the video, they could ask the question, well, why couldn't Edge see that, or Edge should have saw that? That's because he's coming up from the backside. So, cameras are not the end-all, be-all. They just aren't.
I know you're the boss, you're the sheriff, so I don't know if any major captains would ask you this question. Do they think that maybe suspending them was a little too harsh given all the information they had to begin with? I mean, are you taking heat for it all?
I don't know, but all due respect, it doesn't matter what they think. It matters what I say, and
It's lucky Reed didn't get shot, and it's lucky that your officers didn't get shot, your
Right.
deputies didn't get shot. So it seems like you're in a tough spot. So the suspension, is that just to appease people, or is that just what you thought should be?
No, it's what I thought should be done, because Edge, the message needed to be sent to Edge and to others is you need to use good judgment. You need to use good discretion. You need to follow your training. You need to do the right thing, and if you don't, then there needs to be consequences for it. And the reason why you discipline people is to punish the action or inaction at hand and send a message to others as to what's expected. And, and in this situation is that, and again, I go back to, just because you can doesn't mean you should. You need to do it because it's the right thing to do, because it's consistent with training and it's safe. And one of the biggest things that concerns me about this with Edge and what he did was it wasn't safe. You should not be jumping on a guy's back, going hands-on with a guy you believe to have a .45 caliber handgun, rushing up to him and putting yourself in that position and in a crossfire situation. Because if Reed had pulled out a gun and Edge started shooting and Fineran started shooting, they were shooting at each other. So, there's a lot of errors there on Edge's part, and the reason for the suspension was, I think it's commensurate with what he did and what he didn't do, and reflects what he should have done. So, it is significant. It's not an insignificant, but I think it's, again, commensurate with what was done and not done.
Who's the plainclothes man in the video? Is that?
That's Patrick Wilson. That's the citizen. That's the citizen. What happened is that as this fight's ongoing and the deputies are getting exhausted, they're getting spent, and Wilson yells out to Fineran, "Do you want some help? Do you want me to come help?" And Fineran says yes, and then Wilson comes in to help.
This was brought to your attention by Bob Dillinger.
Correct.
So what onus is on the deputies, there were 4 there total, 2 showed up later, and to say something or, spark a review or something along those lines instead of it having to come from the outside?
Well, we have processes in place and procedures in place. They have to do use of force reports. They have to do investigative reports. It was reviewed, but at the time, in that initial review, it wasn't found to be something that was of concern to the people reviewing it. So it's something that we didn't begin to investigate until the complaint was made. And we're going to look at that and look at what we do in that regard. And giving some consideration too, especially in use of force incidents where it's captured on video, is to have that reviewed at a higher level than what we do now, because it does give me some concern that it wasn't caught and that it had to be brought to our attention. That's rarely the case around here. We do a very good job of monitoring deputies and their actions and use of force incidents, and rarely do we have a situation that somebody's bringing something to our attention that we didn't already know about. So that is something we're going to look at.
And who does the reviews?
They're done by sergeants, the supervisors, and the use of force reports, and the lieutenants will review the use of force reports. So they're reviewed by supervisors above the rank of the person who is using force. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. Yep.